Would the Marsilian theory lead to an incipient totalitarianism of the majority? Cannot the whole community assent to laws that are morally objectionable? No. The assent of the community to the laws that govern it is a necessary but not a sufficient condition of the validity of those laws. The laws of a community may or may not conform with justice, but Marsilius thinks that the greater the level of consent to laws, the more likely it is that the laws approved of do in fact conform with justice. What standard of justice are we to employ in these considerations? Not an abstract conception, but one that bears directly on each and everyone's self-interest. Given that communities are formed for the preservation of the individual and the advancement of his interest, this is hardly surprising. Marsilius writes, "Those matters, therefore, that can touch upon the advantage and disadvantage of everyone ought to be known and heard by everyone, so that they can obtain advantage and repel its opposite." The common good of the community, then, is not something over and above the goods of the individuals making up the community. It is rather the sum total of advantage over disadvantage of the individuals in the community. In short, if an individual wants to know what the communal benefit is of any proposed law or regulation, he need only consult his own benefit, and anyone can check whether a proposed law tends more to the advantage of a particular man or men than to that of other men or of the community. Without the test of popular assent, it is likely that the law will lean towards the benefit of the few rather than the many. But where there is none to object to a proposal on the grounds that it is detrimental to his interest, then that law is more than likely to be reasonable. Marsilius doesn't manifest any strong preference for any particular form of governance, either monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy. He is much more concerned that a government be temperate or healthy than that it have a particular constitution, and no government can be healthy or temperate without the consent of the governed. However it comes into being, what is most important for the executive is not only that it give expression to the law as determined by the legislator, it is also that it be supreme. Only if it is supreme or sovereign can it in fact give expression to the law. In considering this aspect of Marsilius's thought, it is difficult not to see this idea of the supremacy of the executive as being, at least in part, a response to the existential conditions of governance in the 14th century. Not only was there a division between the authority of the secular and the spiritual, expressed legally in courts and in claims of jurisdiction, there were also multiple and overlapping forms of each of these two basic types of administration in any given area. For Marsilius, sovereignty is unitary and the secular authority is sovereign. As such, it and it alone has the coercive power that accompanies sovereignty. On this conception of sovereignty, the sacerdotium then can have no coercive power unless such power is delegated to it by the secular authority, and, of course, what is delegated can be undelegated. Insofar as it claims to have a distinct jurisdiction, canon law is an error unless that jurisdiction is confined to purely spiritual matters, with sanctions applying in the hereafter. If it is to have coercive powers in the here and now, it can have them only as delegated to it by the secular power. No other writer in the Middle Ages, writes Sabine, went so far as Marsilio in thus setting apart the spiritual and religious from the legal. Marsilius's theory of sovereignty, with its unitary and exclusive character, is primarily designed to undermine the claim of the sacerdotium to exercise any jurisdiction in the here and now, but its consequences would have been startling to the medieval men in the street. Not only is canon law as a separate system of jurisdiction more or less completely invalidated, all the temporal claims that the Church might make, including that of owning property, are seriously undermined. The Church cannot lay claim to financial support from the Christian community as a matter of right, unless that right be granted and supported by the secular authority. Even the filling of ecclesiastical offices is done only within boundaries set by the secular authority. We can have peace then, according to Marsilius, only if we have a unitary central authority, prince, with coercive power to enforce the law, and there can only be one law for it to enforce. This Marsilian theme, writes Goethe, is the forerunner of the doctrine of politics centred in considerations of power and stability, which have been so characteristic of modern political thought. Does this imply that once we have a prince he may do whatever it is he wishes? Marsilius thinks not. The function of the prince is to execute the law, but the law is not made by him, but by the legislator, which is the whole people, or what Marsilius calls the valentior pars, the stronger part of the people. Morel writes that authority is not wholly transferred. The legislator humanus retains ultimate sovereignty and can check, even depose, the pars principans, the prince, when necessary. Whereas the transient acts of individuals may clash and lead to conflict, the people as a whole desire a peaceful state in which they may pursue their own ends. So the will of an individual may be coerced by the prince, but only if the prince, in so acting, is giving expression to the law that has been willed by all. If you're beginning to see the coming shadow of Rousseau here, you're not wrong. Law has to be given effect through an executive body of some kind or other. Whether this executive body is elected or hereditary is not the primary consideration for Marsilius. What is important is that the executive should act in accordance with the law. That being said, Marsilius clearly has a preference for an elected executive. We need law to regulate excess, and we need someone to do the regulating. There can be only one such regulator, or at least only one supreme regulator in a political community. How do you prevent the prince or the regulator from becoming a tyrant? Marsilius answers, by means of the law. The prince, then, is not the legislator, and the laws limit the prince's power so that he may act legitimately only in accordance with the law. Alan Goerth writes, the upshot, then, is that the people's will is unchallenged as the possessor of supreme authority. Doctrines of popular control were by no means foreign to medieval political thought. The Roman law tradition of the derivation of the emperor's power from the people, the Germanic tradition of the basis of law in immemorial custom, as well as the development of medieval institutions themselves, all pointed in this direction. Yet in no medieval work had this tendency been given so complete, explicit and extensive a statement as in the popular sovereignty of Marsilius. Marsilius gives us the usual 6 types of regime on the Aristotelian model: monarchy, aristocracy, and polity, by which he means moderate democracy, all of these on the good side, and tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy on the bad side. Of interest to us is his description of the good regimes as being tempered, while the bad ones are described as being distempered. Consider Marsilius' account of what he calls a regnum, this term being sometimes translated, somewhat anachronistically, as state. A better term might be realm. There are 4 possible ways to define a regnum or realm. It can be taken as a plurality of cities or provinces contained under one regime, or a temperate regime which one can have even in a single city, or a temperate regime over a plurality of cities or provinces, or finally, whatever it is that all temperate regimes have in common, whether over one city or province or many. Marsilius' political theory is meant to be a one-size-fits-all account, inasmuch as it is not tied to any particular people, nation, area, language, or culture, nor does it endorse or recommend any particular form of political constitution. While relatively indifferent to constitutional forms, Marsilius is far from indifferent to the manner in which the authority of a temperate realm is exercised. Any such realm must have a single supreme ruler, otherwise all will be confusion and chaos. If there are diverse authorities in a given realm, then there must still be one supreme authority to which all the others are ultimately subordinate. There can be only one prince in any political community, only one ultimate law enforcer. Marsilius writes, "In a single city or a single realm, there should be only one single principate, or if there are several, in number or species, as seems expedient in great cities, and most of all in a realm containing a plurality of cities or provinces under one regime, then there should be among them one in number that is supreme over all, to which and through which the rest are reduced and regulated, and any errors that arise in them corrected." The unity Marsilius is talking about here may be either personal or institutional. What would happen if we didn't have such unity? Well, Marsilius writes, "If there were more than one principate in a city or realm," he says, "and they were not reduced or ordered towards any one supreme, then the judgment, command, and execution of what is advantageous and just would fail, and the result, because of injuries remaining unavenged between men, would be fighting, disintegration, and ultimately the destruction of the city or realm." At the end of his book, Marsilius offers us this summary. The first citizen of a civil regime, one man or several, will understand that they alone have the authority to command the subject multitude collectively or individually, and to constrain any individual if it is expedient to do so, according to the laws that have been laid down. He goes on to say that they can do nothing more than this, particularly anything involving difficulty, without the consent of the subject multitude or the legislator, and that the multitude or legislators should not be provoked by injustice, because the force and authority of the principate consists in the express will of this same multitude. On their part, the subject multitude is obliged to obey only the commands of the princely part as being coercive for and in the status of this present world. And, Marsilius says, it will learn to keep as close a watch as possible that the princely or any other part of the community does not presume to be its own arbiter by judging or taking any other action in the city against or outside the laws. Alan Goworth isolates three theses in Marsilius's work. 1. The state or political community exists so that men may live well. 2. Political authority exists to resolve conflicts and so must have coercive power. And 3. The source of legitimate political power is the people. Goworth notes that while no one of these theses is particularly novel, the combination of all three in one work is. The first thesis is characteristic of ideal accounts of politics. The second, of positivistic or realistic accounts, usually opposed to the idealistic. And the third gives an account of the state or political authority which can be set in opposition to both the first two, but in Marsilius's thought is meant to mediate the first and the second dialectically. Given this dialectical tension, it's no wonder that similarities between Marsilius and such diverse thinkers as Hobbes, Machiavelli and Rousseau have been drawn. Marsilius starts with the idea that political obligation is based on the moral ends or virtues that a political community can help its citizens achieve. This idealistic conception is quickly moderated to the less lofty idea that political obligation is based on the ability of the executive office of the political community to prevent conflict and settle disputes. It's important to note that Marsilius never rejects the idealistic conception. He just doesn't pursue it further in Defensor Pacis. While this seems to be an anticipation of a characteristically Hobbesian theme, it is in fact a commonplace of medieval thought. So, for example, Aquinas, in his De Regimine Principum, says that, where there are many men together and each one looks out for what suits himself, the multitude would be broken up unto diverse parts, unless there were someone to watch out for that which concerns the good of the multitude. And of course, we have the typical Augustinian theme behind all this, to the effect that the sinfulness of men is what makes government necessary. The approach a political philosopher takes towards a sociological fact, if it is a fact, determines to a large extent the outcome of his philosophy. If he takes it to be something relatively insignificant, something to be dealt with expeditiously before moving on to higher things, we will get a generally more optimistic political philosophy. If, as here, it is a recurring drumbeat that sounds all the way through, then the political philosophy is likely to be much less optimistic. This is what we find in Machiavelli and in Hobbes. Once again, Marsilius does not deny that the content of the law is determined relative to some standard of reason or justice. But the essential characteristic of law is a command backed by coercive force. Once again, this is an idea that will echo in Hobbes and others. I leave the last word to Morel. He writes, though even Marsilio did not realize it, the Christian Commonwealth, in the form in which the Middle Ages had created it, was ceasing to exist, and in its place a new political leitmotif was coming into control: the modern state.